All right, this presentation will focus on the U.S. in the 1920s, specifically the economic, political, and social problems that the U.S. experienced after the end of World War I. So if you've been paying attention in class, it's going to kind of sum up the different charts that we've been filling out um, and kind of lead us into the big business boom of the 1920s. So one of the first big problems that the U.S. had after World War I was kind of economic problems. We were faced with a weakened economy. And remember, during World War I, the economy boomed because so many factories were providing like weapons and materials for government contracts, and so factories were hiring. And then when the war ends, the government cancels a bunch of contracts, and the factories end up closing down or laying people off. So a lot of the wartime jobs ended after the war. And then at the same time as people are getting laid off, 4 million soldiers came home from the war. So you've already got unemployed people, not a lot of jobs to go around, and then 4 million more kind of work eligible people are coming home from the war. Many businesses ended up failing, and many factories closed, and about 5 million people were unemployed. And on top of that, inflation was making everything worse. So things cost more money than they did before the war. And then again, on top of that, so many people were unemployed. These economic problems kind of also start leading to some political problems. So the first one is kind of the radical groups. So radicals were people with extreme political beliefs who also want change. And after World War I, the radical groups became more active. Some of these groups were becoming more active because they had seen the success of the Russian Revolution and they wanted it to spread to other places. So radicals were staging strikes in many areas, and there were several bombings. Some bombs were sent through the mail. The Attorney General's house was bombed, and Wall Street was bombed. There's also an increase in immigration. So during the war, immigration had stopped. And then after the war, it picks back up again. And a lot of people associated immigrants with radical groups. Right, so many people associated immigrants with radical groups. A lot of immigrants were coming from Italy and Eastern Europe, and they had associated with like anarchism with the Italians, Eastern Europe with communism and socialism. And on top of all of this, the immigrants added to the unemployment problem. And kind of on top of all of that, the effects of the economic problems also led to an increase in crime. So people who were out of a job were looking for other ways to support their family. Business owners tried to cut wages and increase the number of hours. Labor unions staged strikes to try to protect the interests of their members, and the strikes grew more and more violent. This led to some challenges to our rights. So the Red Scare in the 20s was when people were concerned about radical activities, leading to the Palmer raids to try and crack down on radicals. So people suspected of radical activities were arrested and held without trial, which kind of goes against our Constitution. Many radicals were deported. And again, the arresting people suspected of activities and holding them without trial kind of goes against some of the basic rights in our listed in our Bill of Rights and Constitution, going against our civil liberties. And the economic and political problems kind of help lead to social problems. So I'm actually going to talk about nativism first, and that is nativism is anti-immigrant feelings. And because of the economic and political problems, people were becoming more anti-immigrant. Laws were passed to limit immigration and to favor immigrants from Northern and Western Europe who were viewed as less radical. And this is also the time when not a lot of immigrants were actually from Northern and Western Europe. This also leads to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which had almost died out. However, it was revived in the 1920s, and in addition to being sort of anti-African American or anti-Black, they also became anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and anti-Jewish, and were prejudiced towards those people. And the KKK portrayed themselves as defending American values. African Americans and Asians faced discrimination as well. Asians were not allowed to become citizens, and several states prevented them from owning land. Black veterans had difficulty finding jobs, and many African Americans were lynched by mobs in 1919. All right. The 1920s was also the Republican era of presidents. So this next bit is going to focus on politics and business. Harding was elected president in 1920. Again, it began a period where the Republican Party dominated the government. Harding was committed to supporting the free enterprise system where a government places few restrictions on business. This is also known as capitalism or the free market. Harding cut taxes, spending, and the debt. He also appointed his friends to government jobs, which led to scandals. He had a heart attack, and his vice president Coolidge stepped in and became president. He also cut taxes and got rid of unnecessary spending, so kind of keeping in line with the economic policies. And then in 1929, Hoover became president. He also promoted big business. He encouraged associationalism, where industry leaders joined together to improve efficiency. So this is like where the there were hundreds of car companies, and in the 1920s they joined together to form several large car companies like Ford and General Motors. And under the Republican president's economic policies, the post-World War I recession ended. Businesses expanded, unemployment dropped, and wages doubled. During the 1920s, new fields like aviation and automobiles rose. Ford's assembly line allowed him to produce more cars more quickly and for less money. A few businesses grew and took over smaller ones. And what's important to note is that not everyone prospered during this time. Many middle-class families did not share in the prosperity, and they were earning well below what it took to live a comfortable lifestyle. Farmers had an especially difficult time. Many were struggling with wartime debts. This also led to worse conditions for farm workers, which included many minorities. Unskilled laborers struggled to stay employed. Coal miners were laid off as energy sources switched to gas and electricity. African American workers also suffered. They tended to be the last to be hired, the first to be fired. They were paid less, and they were barred from most unions. So again, lots of prosperity during this time, but not everyone was sharing in the prosperity.